Most people who listen to this message will probably either have already passed along or they are in the process of deciding what they're going to pass down to the next generation when it comes to all of the earthly stuff that they've accumulated. Now, most of the time, we're going to do that through a will, an official document that spells out so-and-so is going to get this and so-and-so is going to get that, and that's how it's all supposed to work out. Because you know what? When we go to be with Jesus, we just don't really care what's going to happen with all of our stuff. But you know what? There are going to be some other people who are going to procrastinate. And your kids are going to inherit the gift of having to sort through all of your stuff and decide for themselves who gets what donated to them, and then what goes to the landfill. Okay? I don't know which category you're in there, but you're going to be one of those two. It was pretty easy for my sisters and I when my parents passed away, because Mom and Dad basically left everything to the three of us, and we got to decide what to do with it, okay? It was really kind of a fun experience for me. I remember walking through their house with Denise and Anita and just looking at all of the stuff and deciding who wanted what. And it was really pretty easy because when we came to something, if we had an interest in it, we were to express that. And if all three of us had an interest in something, we would just stop and say, hey, why is this important to you? And then we would share what memory we had or why it was important. And you know what? It became so obvious on every single thing which one of us should receive certain things. You know what? It was really a pleasant memory, and I thank God that I had two great sisters to walk through that whole experience with me. But you know what? There was a lot of stuff that we didn't want that was left over. And so we had that infamous Johnson Estate auction, okay? Some of you were there, you remember that. Hundreds of people showed up, and they carted off just lots and lots of stuff that we didn't want. One of the things they took, though, was my great-grandfather's moonshine still. Now, we didn't know he had that until we were going through the attic, and we found it. And you know what? I wish I would have kept it. Because just think of the stories about the preacher still, okay, that could be going around all over the place. I really regret having not kept that, okay? But life is what it is. And all of us need to decide what we're going to do with our quote-unquote stuff, because we can't take it with us when we leave this place. But more importantly, I think we need to decide what we're going to leave to the next generation when it comes to our faith. I think there are some axioms that we need to pass down to the next generation. And at least in my mind, I see a connection between these things that we pass down to those treasures in heaven that Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. I can remember hearing when I was younger that, Christianity and the church is really only one generation away from extinction. You ever thought about that? That if we don't pass down to our kids, our grandkids and our great-grandkids may not have any spiritual foundation, because you know what? Biblical truth just won't be relevant to them. It won't be important to them like it is to us. I can't help but wonder, okay? I can't help but wonder if all that's going on in the world today isn't at least a partial unveiling of the consequences of past generations not passing down the right faith elements. If that's the case, then we've got to make a decision. How are we going to navigate this time that we're currently living in? Are we going to be one who's just going to pull up our anchor and say, hey, we're just going to drift until we die, and then we're going to pray that God is going to do something to keep the faith alive in the next generations? Or are we going to be the people who make it a special attempt to share with the next generation those treasures in heaven? You know what? As a church that's pretty strong in the contingency of older generations, I'm praying that we are committed to passing down things to the next generation that are important to our faith. I hope that we just don't pull up our anchors and say, God, it's up to you. I want to share an observation that I'm making that I'm seeing repeatedly about younger generations, and you've probably seen it too, and that is that they're really not as interested in learning what we know until they see us living it. And this comes back to mind when I think about, you know what, they could really, I don't want to say care less, but they could probably not care near as much about whether or not we can quote Matthew 22:39 that says God commanded us to love our neighbors, as they are seeing us wear a mask to protect our neighbor who might have a susceptibility to the coronavirus. Today's younger generations aren't as concerned about hearing biblical knowledge from us as they are seeing us live out that knowledge in our lives. And what that does is that gets their attention. And eventually they'll say, okay, why did you do that? And you can share that basis and that foundation, those axioms of faith that you build your life on with them. But if all we want to do is to just give it to them, they're probably not going to listen. You know, the story that we're going to look at today as part of our summer series from the Old Testament book of Daniel, I think reminds us of just how important it is that we pass down the right, quote-unquote, stuff to the next generation, who then can pass it on to the next generation. Because if we don't, God can choose some pretty nasty things to happen in people's lives. For the past 3 weeks, we've seen how hard God has tried to get Nebuchadnezzar's attention and tell him that these fake gods that you're following are useless. Follow the God of Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. Follow me because I am the one true God and the powerful God. God did some amazing things, trying to get Nebuchadnezzar's attention, and there were moments when it almost appeared like he got it. But you know what? When it comes down to what he passed down to the next generation of leadership in Babylon, it proves that I think proves to me that the apple didn't fall very far from the tree that he had planted early on in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. We're ready for chapter 5 today, if you want to turn to that, Daniel chapter 5. And Nebuchadnezzar is now out of the picture, and Daniel and his friends are undergoing another big change after having been carried off to Babylon. There's a new king in town, okay? His name is Belshazzar. It's no longer Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the writer of Daniel identifies Belshazzar as the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he could have been his grandson. He may not have even been related to him at all, because history shows that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus, who co-reigned over the Babylonian Empire after Nebuchadnezzar's exit. So we don't know for sure the direct relationship, even though the writer of Daniel says that he's his son. That may be metaphorical, just talking about he was the next leader in that nation. But look at what he does that's very similar to what Nebuchadnezzar does, which makes me think that they're probably related. Okay? Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. Ever notice how repetitive? It's like, every time God says something, it's repeated verbatim. Not a bad thing. Here's what I think we notice in other places in the Old Testament. It's not uncommon for kings to give big parties, lavish parties. But the thing we can't miss about this particular one was its timing. It had been prophesied hundreds of years before. Dreams had fulfilled it. But the fact was, it was a fact that the Babylonian Empire was going to fall. And one of the greatest and most fierce empires in the history of mankind was on that edge at this day. The Medes and the Persians had been taking over strategic cities all around Babylon. And Belshazzar had to know that Babylon was next on their list. And so what does he do? He throws a party for 1,000 of his best friends. Now, why did he do it right then? There's a lot of speculation. Some say maybe it was a last rallying cry. He wanted to gather the troops one more time and give them a pep talk and say, hey, we can get through this. More than likely, it was he knew what was going to happen. And he just wanted to have a party at the end. You know what? We don't know his motivation for the banquet, but we do know some of the things that happened. And one of the things that happened was, while they were drinking and getting drunk, he decided, hey, let's go get some special goblets that they took from Jerusalem, and let's drink wine out of them. You know what? That in itself probably isn't a huge problem, but it's what they did when they were drinking out of those goblets that I think was really the problem. Look at chapter 5, verse 4. As they drank the wine out of those goblets, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Therein lies the problem. And I think this is the first axiom that we really need to take note of and that we need to pass down to the next generation. And it's this: worshiping idols makes God mad. Can I make it any simpler than that? Worshiping idols makes God mad. Praising statues and idols had long since been a temptation to the Israelites. And that's why when God gave them new parcels of land, he would tell them to go in and destroy everything, especially their idols. Why? Because he knew how tempted they were to worship them. If you ever want to hear about God getting really upset in the Bible, read those passages where his people worshiped stone and wood. Started with Moses on the Mount Sinai, did it not? He was getting the Ten Commandments. The Israelites were worshiping the golden calf. Read in Judges, read in Joshua, or I'm sorry, Judges and Kings, and you'll hear story after story of the Israelites worshiping wood and stone. I really wish that I could say that Christians don't do that today. And maybe we don't worship wood and stone as much today, but do we not have our own virtual images, our philosophical things that we will praise and give more attention to than God? Maybe it's our possessions. Maybe it's the very stuff that we're going to pass down to our kids that we are more concerned about than we are giving praise to God. Maybe it's a political affiliation where a donkey or an elephant is more important to us than God. I know younger generations have this struggle of a cause that can become more important to them than God. We can make a very long list of all the things that we are guilty of putting before God and that they have become idols. But perhaps instead of listing all of those things like Belshazzar did, maybe we just need to stick with that basic axiom that says that, you know what, if we worship idols, we're going to make God mad. Can we just remember that? You know, in times where everything is changing, it's easy to get upset because we feel like someone's taking something that's sacred away from us. And let me ask you this question. Have you ever thought about when something is being taken from you, asking yourself, are they taking God away from me? Or are they taking an idol away from me? Which is more important? God or something that someone else has the ability to take from us? Because Paul says nothing can separate us from God. Absolutely nothing. No one can take God from us. They can make it harder for us to worship him, to gather and to practice our faith the way that we have in the past. But you know what? Nothing can take him away from us. You know, there was a lot of outcry when they said that you couldn't pray in school anymore. I guarantee you, there's still prayer in school. Every child who hasn't prepared for a test is praying before they take that test. The difference between Belshazzar and Daniel, one of the big differences was the king wasn't willing to set aside all the created stuff and to really give praise to the Creator. So he focused on the gold and the silver and the bronze and the iron and the wood and the stone. And in his particular case, because he had done that so much, God said enough. And so God sent him a memo. Anybody here ever said, boy, I wish God would just send me a memo and tell me what's going to happen next? Careful what you ask for. Okay, because it might just turn out the way that it did for Belshazzar, which we read in verse 5 of chapter 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the walls near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. I love this quote from John Goldingay in his writing on the book of Daniel. He says, "The king's worship of lifeless gods provoked a hidden theophany in the form of a living hand." I love that. Well, of course, Belshazzar didn't understand the message from God any more than Nebuchadnezzar understood. So what did he do? He brought in the wise guys. And the wise guys couldn't tell him what it meant either. And so it goes back to the queen. Okay, once again, the queen saves the day. Now, whether it was his mom or his grandmother, who knows? But the queen says, hey, you know what? There's this guy from Israel. His name is Daniel, which is interesting. She uses his Hebrew name and not his Babylonian name. This guy named Daniel who has the spirit of the holy God in him, and he can interpret dreams. And so what the king does is he calls him in and says, Daniel, can you help me out? And he says, you know what? If you can help me, I'm going to give you more authority than you have now, and I'm going to give you some great prizes or great gifts. Daniel basically says this: keep your stuff, king. I don't want your stuff. And before I tell you what the dream means, let me tell you something that should have been passed down to you if it wasn't. Look with me at verse 18 in Daniel chapter 5. He says, O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Right off the bat, he had nothing to do with it, Belshazzar. It was from God. Because of his high position that God gave him, all the peoples of the nations and the men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with wild donkeys and he ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of the heavens, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdom of men and sets up over them anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from the temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. Excuse me. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hands your life and your ways. Somehow, this message had been passed down, according to the author, to Belshazzar, but he just didn't comprehend it. Which suggests to me a second axiom that we need to pass down to the next generation. And it's one that even though we think they get it, we need to repeat it over and over and over again. And it's this: be humble, honor God. Be humble and honor God. I think the second axiom is tied to the first one in that we honor God when we place him first in our lives and not allow anything else to become more important than him. I think Daniel's statement alone about why we should honor God in that he holds our life and our ways in his hands, that's enough. And the moment we begin to think that what we accomplish in this life is of our doing, listen for that voice like Nebuchadnezzar heard, or look for that hand that might write on the wall. When it comes to our kids, it's a fine line between instilling self-confidence and pride. We want our kids to be confident in the world. There's no question about that. But we also know that they have to be humble. Because as we talked about last week, that humiliation process is even tougher. The goal for us is to remain humble, knowing that our confidence comes because our God is capable of doing anything. If we ask him and we allow him, he will do what he knows is best in anything we ask. But we need to give him credit for that when it happens. Wasn't that the secret to Daniel's success? He could do anything that other people couldn't do, but he always said, it's not me. It's God who I trust that is getting me giving me the ability to do this. So I'm wondering this morning if how much easier it would be if we're having to endure change in our life if we just didn't trust God more to handle the things than we are now. This church has had a very long relationship with Lincoln Christian University, and a lot of changes have taken place in Lincoln in just the last few weeks, not necessarily because of the pandemic, but because of transitions and new realities that have been set into place. Next month, Don Green, who served as the president for 7 years, is going to come and share with our church. He's handed over the reins of leadership to a young leader named Silas McCormick, who I know is going to do a great job of leading the university. But one of the other changes that's taken place is that Lynn Laughlin's retired, okay, after 56 years. I wish I could say that's more years than I've been alive, but I can't. 56 years, Lynn has finally retired, and he's done just about every role that you could imagine at that college over those 56 years. But in the latest newsletter that came out from the school, he wrote an article that just kind of summarized the things that he's done. And there's a sentence that just popped out of this that just sounds so much like Lynn. It says this: "The greatest joy of a career spent at Lincoln is the privilege of getting to know all the people whose paths have crossed mine." If you know Lynn Laughlin, if you've met him once, he remembers your name. It's disgusting how he can do that. But you know what? You remember Lynn because he is so humble. He's always looking for a way to honor God and to honor you as you're talking with him. You know what? That's going to be a huge gap for Lincoln to fill, but I'm sure that God will give someone else with a humble heart the ability to take his place. Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. And the reality changed very quickly one night while he was having a party in the palace. In fact, let's read about how quickly it changed at the end of Daniel chapter 5. Look down at verse 26. Daniel interprets these three words that were written on the wall. He says this: Mene means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. That's pretty sobering news, but look how quickly it came about. Verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Maybe Belshazzar knew just how close the Medes were to conquering his palace, and maybe he didn't. But you know what? Within hours of this king's prideful worship of idols, he entered an eternal destiny in the hands of an angry but just God. Before that happened, God made sure that Daniel received some more authority and some more standing so that he could help lead during the next transition, the new reality that would take place. We'll look at that next week. So I'm wondering this morning, we've been experiencing a lot of new realities in our world lately. And maybe it's because previous generations didn't pass down the right stuff to the next generations. But you know what? My guess is my generation, your generations, we're going to do the same thing. We're not going to pass down the right stuff. So what we have to do is we've got to trust God even more than we do. And we have to rely on his grace at every single step. No matter what our age or our phase in life, I think these two axioms that I've shared with you today are eternal and universal and really need to be shared. So willing ourselves to help the next generation avoid idol worship, to honor God, and to live humbly is something that we need to do in two ways: in our actions and in our words. And you know what the next generation is going to listen to most. It's what we do more than what we say. I pray that we don't make the same mistake that Nebuchadnezzar made with Belshazzar, but that we will be very intentional about passing on these truths, these axioms that are treasures in heaven. Can we do that?